But Jasmine, thanks so much for joining us. And if you can give a brief introduction to, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. I think it's so funny that we met before. When I was a product manager, I think writing is much more fun than being a product manager is what I've discovered, but that was all right too. And yeah, I think what happened was I was working at Substack for many years and I just got so envious of people like you, writers on the other side of the platform. I was like, I think their job sounds better. So I made the financially inadvisable decision of leaving tech and deciding to become a writer. But yeah, these days I write mostly on Substack, jasmine.substack.com. I also am a contributor at The Atlantic. I freelance for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc. And I mostly cover AI in Silicon Valley. I describe my work as a quote unquote anthropology of disruption. I think the thing that I'm really interested in is what happens basically when a frontier technology collides with pre existing cultures, communities, and institutions. I think as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, I live in San Francisco, I went to school around here, and in some senses has been very immersed in the tech industry and worked in it for many years. But also, I am really interested in broader social, political, societal concerns and trying to look at the intersection of those things from sort of the heart of Silicon Valley, doing reporting, doing analysis has been really fun. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. So let's dive in on some of those societal concerns. So you wrote a fantastic Substack article talking about, AI populism and then this kind of, Times piece on the AI underclass. And so in that article you wrote about that, the rich are pulling further ahead. There's this incredible accumulation of wealth that they're getting from these AI advancements. You also wrote that, kind of as those advancements are pulling ahead, there's this emerging, underclass, people being who are rendered useless and unemployable and left to, kind of persist on welfare scraps. And when I first read that, it sort of struck me as hyperbolic. Like, is this really the worlds that we are heading in? But you have talked so much with founders and researchers and teams at OpenAI and Anthropic. Like, can you talk a bit more about what you learned, how you kind of came to this view that there is this AI underclass that's emerging?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should start out by saying that I don't endorse the belief that there is an AI underclass
Of
coming.
course.
So the headline of the piece is Silicon Valley braces for a permanent underclass, and a lot of what I tried to do in the story is to explain the common belief or argument that in AI that the median person is screwed because AI is going to be a one-to-one substitute for labor and prevent normal people from having labor value, from having economic mobility, from being able to get and succeed in their jobs. I actually specifically don't endorse this view, partly for sort of economic reasons. I think AI diffusion is slow. I think that humans will remain complements in many senses. But also crucially, because I think having an underclass is always a policy choice. And so AI is not the first time that the United States or any country has contended with people who are displaced by technological automation, people who are end up structurally unemployed, who end up struggling to find a new job to participate in the economy. And my argument ultimately in this New York Times piece is that I do want policymakers to take the steps necessary to prevent the creation of any kind of underclass resulting from AI. So maybe that's like the important clarification I want to make. If you want, I can then go and try to explain what these some people in Silicon Valley believe about the underclass and how they believe it could come about. And I can lay out that argument if that's helpful. But I just do want to make pretty clear that that's not my most likely predicted scenario.
Yeah, so let's talk about that view that those folks in Silicon Valley, have, right? I think, you know, Dario Amodei, right, wrote that, massive 20,000 word, essay, about this, possible emerging AI underclass and like that view that's happening. And I know you had also mentioned, a handful of great policy interventions that we'll get to in a second that can help combat that. But like, is that like this type of view that you see emerging from some of these like top executives at these companies, or is that something that you're also hearing from people who are lower down in the food chain at these large AI labs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing about it from a lot of levels. I think one of the reasons that I decided that I wanted to write this piece is because, again, I live in San Francisco and I spend a good amount of time both reporting reasons and socially just talking to people who are engineers, researchers, people working at these AI labs. And one you kind of hear repeatedly this meme of escaping the permanent underclass. And to some extent, it's a bit of a joke. People say like, "Oh God, I gotta get a job at OpenAI because I need to escape the permanent underclass," or something like this. But there's also a sense in which you can tell it's really not that much of a joke. In fact, people do believe that they have a limited window of time to build wealth before the returns to capital increase a lot and the returns to labor decrease in value. And so there are a lot of folks in Silicon Valley, young workers too, not just executives, who have kind of decided that because they believe AI will soon become a replacement for human labor, that they need to spend the next 2 years accumulating as much wealth as possible, whether that's by joining one of these AI labs so that they can have some of the equity and get rich when they IPO, whether that's starting and hopefully selling a startup or doing something like that. If I were to sort of flesh out and steelman the argument for the permanent underclass for people who aren't super familiar with it, it's basically this theory that AI or AGI or super intelligence or whatever the super powerful AI thing is going to eventually be advanced enough in partnership with robotics to fully replace human labor. So anything a human can do, physical world, cognitive world, any kind of thing, whether it's a technical task, a fuzzy relational task, someday machines will be able to do it all. If that ends up being true, and also Moore's law holds, meaning that we get more powerful AI at cheaper and cheaper costs, then the value of human labor is going to decrease while the returns to capital increase because a wealthy person, a business owner, a capital owner is always going to be able to rent a robot instead of a person. And it's going to be cheaper to do so, especially as these costs fall. Whereas workers who used to be able to acquire leverage by selling their expertise and their labor, they will no longer have a comparative advantage over the machines, over the robots. And in that world, the idea is that people would get frozen in their current class position. So if you're already really rich, if you're already a capital owner, you're going to be able to rent as much robot labor as you want. And if you're just, a plain old worker like you and me, or I don't know about you, but like
No,
me, like
I am a plain old worker. Yes.
like I'm going to be screwed. I'm going to be useless, unemployable. AI is going to be able to write so much better than me and like do Substack way better than me, and I'm just going to be end up on welfare or like screwed. And that's kind of what the permanent underclass is. And so again, I think the most extreme version of this argument is beyond what my personal prediction would be. I think we're quite a long ways out from full automation. Like robotics is lagging behind LLMs. There's a lot of jobs that I don't think are just about intelligence and cognitive labor. At the same time, I think it's really meaningful that there are a wider and wider swath of tasks in the economy that humans are currently doing in order to make a living that machines are going to be able to do faster at lower costs and perhaps even better in some cases. And that does have a lot of serious economic implications.
Absolutely. And this timeline question in there as well, it feels so prescient of, is this something that is going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 or 20 years? Where do we think about some of those challenges? And it's so interesting, this note of like, oh, I need to go work at, NVIDIA. I need to go work at OpenAI in order to get ahead, rings so much of this narrative that we hear of like the economy as a casino as well, right? This
Yes, absolutely.
idea that like, there are only these certain ways that we can get ahead, and that's betting through Polymarket. But there's this actual other channel, which is you know in some ways more traditional, like salary based, but like betting on this future where AI is such a dominant position.
Yeah, and it's
um
really betting on the equity. It's not betting on the salary. The reason that these people want to work on at NVIDIA and at Anthropic is because of the equity, and the idea that the equity ownership is going to go up in value like crazy and they'll be capital owners. So it's really not a salary thing.
right, being part of one of these few possible trillion-dollar companies,
Hmm.
that we might see some of those IPOs this year.
Hmm.
You've touched a bit on some of the policy parts of AI, and I know you've kind of been having some interesting conversations. And so I would love to hear, I know you talked a bit about this event that you had attended, in San Francisco with David Shore and some of that, but there have been all of these policy ideas that have been thrown around to sort of address some of these, dystopian futures, things like federal job guarantees, workforce training programs, universal basic income, these ideas to help make sure that we can, keep that floor in a steady state, or lift it up for workers who are maybe, kind of challenged by this. I know you have also said like the SF to DC axis is one of the most important axes in the world right now. Um, I would love for you to talk a bit about like what you're seeing in that SF to DC axis. Um, what that event was like, and whether some of these like policy ideas are ones that like seem to be resonating more in some of these circles and other ones that people are like, no, that's just like simple talk, but that'll never happen.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I've been spending more and more time in Washington D.C. over the past, few years, and before, like one way of thinking about sort of the sweep of recent AI history, at least the LLM's era of AI history, is you can split it into three eras. You can split it into an academic era, a commercial era, and a political era. And the academic era is sort of when OpenAI is still a true nonprofit, when everybody's open sourcing all their technology. There are lots of collaborations between universities, researchers, and people at the labs. And it's like super, yeah, like no one knows what the tech is going to be used for. They're just like, wow, these like new architectures like the transformer, like really interesting. And then you enter this commercial era that's really picked up with ChatGPT, right? Where ChatGPT is the first like hit use case for normal people to actually take advantage of LLMs, where they're not just a toy demo and they're actually something that it turns out has a lot of economic value. Like people are willing to pay quite a lot of money in order to access whether it's chatbots or coding agents or whatever it is. And so I think the past few years have been, 2022 to 2025, this commercial era of AI with like tons of both enterprise and consumer revenue flowing towards the product companies that are selling chatbots and agents. And the thing that has just started to really pick up in earnest, I think in the past, 6 months or something, is entering the serious political era of AI, where governments, national governments, are starting to take extremely seriously the fact that AI could both be a huge geopolitical advantage insofar as, the Pentagon is using Claude to identify targets, like attack
Right. Yeah.
targets in
Iran war
Iran,
that
which is
thrust that
crazy.
into.
It is, or like cybersecurity, right? Like now AI is a core part of cyber offense and cyber defense, and there's an interest in that. But also on the societal point of view, um, if it is true, if it is the case that AI ends up disrupting millions of jobs or tens of millions of jobs, or even a fraction of Dario Amode's predictions come true, that is going to be a huge deal that like the United States federal government or any government around the world needs to be able to manage, right? Like that is a threat to their legitimacy as a government if AI shows up and like breaks apart the social fabric and takes everybody's jobs while accruing all of that wealth into like a small number of private companies. And so I think we've sort of entered this new era of AI where the policymakers are starting to take AI very seriously. They no longer view it as a stochastic parrot. And what they're really trying to do is grapple with the huge societal, economic, and military challenges that AI poses. And so it's been super interesting to sort of spend more time in DC talking to different folks in the policy ecosystem as they try to sort out what to do about all this.
Yeah. So can you talk a bit about like the some of the events that you have attended there, what you are hearing from some of these like policymakers, and in particular what you think they're missing? Like I, spent a long time working in federal government. Like I had
Mhm.
done some, cybersecurity and technology work, and now, kind of being on the, more tech side of things, like it's clear to me as well how little often policymakers really understand how, some of this deep tech is working. Like when you're at these things or people like, these DC policymakers feel like they really understand it, like, or does it feel like this is such an unknown feature and they're sort of saying these tropes about the world?
Yeah. I would say until the last 6 months, people really didn't understand it. As in, like, a lot of folks thought that AI was definitely a bubble, as in not just like maybe there's some financial froth, but like doesn't have any actual value. It's all fake. There's no real use cases. It's just hallucinating. And so, I think that there was a pervasive belief, especially among a lot of progressives for a long time, that AI just couldn't actually do stuff. It was just fancy autocomplete and couldn't do any valuable work anyway. And so I think that was a huge hindrance to trying to do any proactive policymaking, because it turns out that AI can't do a lot, but it also can do a lot, right? And so that was a big problem. And I'd talk to people working in the AI policy space, and they'd say that like people would say, oh, we don't worry about job displacement because everyone's just going to be a prompt engineer. I'm like, no, like prompt engineers, like we're like 3 years past that. Come on, guys. And so a lot of the older politicians, they've never used ChatGPT. They've never used a coding agent. Maybe they like understand a chatbot, but they don't understand the cybersecurity implications. They don't understand that these things are finding bugs in cyber infrastructure that no human has ever found before. And so now we're not just talking about like, oh, it's like a helpful little assistant, but like that is like now more valuable than your average cybersecurity researcher to have access to, say, Claude Mythos or something like that, right? And so there definitely is a lot of catch up, but I would say that these days Washington is more in a position of knowing that they don't know. They know that AI is a big deal and that they should be doing something about it, but they don't know what to do about it and they don't know how to think about it yet. I still consider this improvement. The other kind of funny thing that's happening recently, and especially as I've started paying more attention to the AI backlash and what I sort of describe as AI populism, is there's an increasing force of these movements to regulate AI and to slow down or stop its progress. I think for most of the past few years, because AI had not really entered the mainstream political consciousness, it was mostly some like AI safety policy wonks who were in
Right.
back rooms designing chip control policies. But nowadays, all sorts of interest groups, people from labor unions, environmental groups, religious groups, states' rights groups, and like all sorts of people who never had an AI plan or agenda before, they are now realizing that AI is intersecting with their pet issue. And so they are getting mobilized on AI, usually to regulate AI. They are forming these like very strange bedfellows coalitions. So like I will literally be at a meeting room table while like a family first conservative and like a super progressive Democrat are sitting side by side, like working together in order to stop the AI accelerationists. And so I remember I was sitting with this one guy who's like kind of a MAGA guy, like a right wing populist, or at least used to be a MAGA guy. And I was asking him about these coalitions and what it's like to work with these effective altruists, like doomer types on AI regulation. And he was like, well, like, I wouldn't invite my kids for a play date at the polycule. But in terms of coalitions, like I'm open to that. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh man, like this is really crazy. People must really care about this topic if they are reaching across those kinds of aisles and those kinds of fractures.
So can you give a kind of, definition of AI populism here for, the group? Because I think it has really joined, different folks along this view that, you know, AI is maybe this like elite project that is being forced down some people's throats and that it's, going to cause, this massive displacements. Like, how have you, defined it? And then, I think it's really interesting as you're starting to see these kind of interesting coalitions showing up.
Yeah, so the way that I define AI populism is a worldview where AI is not viewed as a normal technology, like a tool or a product, but rather as an elite political project to be resisted. And the way that I came to this definition was I was trying to figure out like why are AI critics and AI enthusiasts always talking past each other? And one set of people, like a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley, will be like, "But AI is so useful. Like, I love using Claude Code to like help me code faster, and like Waymos are so much safer. Like, I don't understand why people don't like these things." And then on the other side, you'll have AI critics being like, why, like AI is being introduced to replace workers. It's being shoved down my throat. It's surveilling. It's increasing mass surveillance. Like it's replacing our human relationships with AI relationships. And what I realized was that people are actually talking largely on two different levels, right?
Mm,
And so, like, one level is this tool useful to me personally as a consumer? Which is a lot of the enthusiasts kind of focus on that is like, is it useful? And the answer might be yes. Like, I think a lot of the tools are pretty useful personally. But then on the other hand, you have people who are saying this isn't about just like a consumer tool. It is about a movement or a political project where elites, whether it's billionaires, people in politics, whatever, are trying to reorganize society around their own profits and their own power over the broad populace. And AI is kind of being introduced as a tool to, again, do things like replace human labor, replace human creativity. And so when people are resisting the political project of replacing human relations with AI relations, they don't really care if it's a useful tool because what they're really resisting is AI as this avatar of a broader political project.
I love history. I love like thinking about this moment and whether this is actually this unique moment in time or we have sort of, seen this story play out before. I hear kind of these continued analogies about this, moment of, is this similar to, workforce changes of the 1960s when IBM was automating, kind of all these different actuarial processes or when we were changing, control boards for phone communication, whether this is like the China trade shock in 2001 when they were, admitted into the WTO. I think, there was this article by Torsten Slok, the economist at Apollo earlier today, making this exact same comparison again. Are there parts of this like AI populism that feel like this same type of argument again, that like again it's this labor versus capital, or there is something that actually feels really unique about this moment and that we are at this like real transition phase, or we've always seen disruptions, to the workforce. There has always been this challenge between labor and capital. Um, right? I think even that term of the AI underclass, or the term underclass, emerged in the 1960s. Right now,
Mhm.
we've kind of just put the AI part in front of it. It's like, is this we're seeing the same story again, and we actually maybe have a playbook from the past to work through it, or this does feel like this unique point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is worth looking at history. I am probably less of a history buff than you are, but like I have been thinking about like the industrialization and pathways of factory automation and things like that. I do think it's really useful to look at historical examples. In particular, that's books that studied history was part of what helped me at least come to the conclusion that like you can't actually get the economic gains from adopting automating technologies unless you are able to come to a deal to support citizens and support workers through that, because otherwise they're just going to revolt and it would be rational for them to do so. So I definitely think it's worth studying history. I think that the things that are different in the AI backlash are mostly in a difference in scale would be my argument.
Mhm.
I mean, ChatGPT is the fastest adopted consumer application in history. The scale of investment and the share of national GDP that is coming from data center and AI related investments is pretty unfathomable. I think St. Louis Fed said it was 39% in the first 3 quarters of 2025 is tied of GDP growth in the US was tied to AI and data center
Yeah, that was
investments.
an unbelievable stat when I saw that.
It is unbelievable. I think someone else came to like a 90% crazy stat, but that seemed like a little too much. So I was like, I'll actually pick the conservative number of 39%, which is nuts. And so, and AI is like, it is both a general technology, right? And so, like, it's not just affecting cab drivers with Waymos, but it's also affecting screenwriters because of LMs and software engineers. And like, there's a huge swath of jobs that could be affected, impacted by, automated by AI. And so, what it means is that the coalition is much broader and also the backlash is stronger because there are more people who might not ordinarily see themselves as political allies. I don't know that, like, cab drivers and software engineers are usually sort of on the same side of these battles or both feel as equally activated.
Yeah,
But
it's
I
a great
think that
point.
we are in a moment where the solidarity and the strength of the backlash is much broader. And that's why you get these strange bedfellows coalitions, is because so many different groups of people feel like they are being affected by AI. It's also not like crypto, where only a small number of people ever really
Mm,
use crypto, right? Like the people who use crypto really cared about it. There are definitely some politicians who are very focused on crypto fraud and stuff like that, but for the most part, most people could happily ignore crypto, never worry about it. But AI is something that anyone who's in school, anyone who's in a workplace doing some kind of knowledge work, like everyone is probably being exposed to AI in a pretty regular way in some form. And so, again, I think the scale of diffusion adoption and the generality of it, the sense that it could affect so many jobs at the same time, is what is contributing to the intensity of the backlash.
yeah, I mean, I even saw someone in the chat too talking about how they work in the auto industry, but are have this big AI summit that they're attending today as well. And so I think that
Mm, hmm
interesting intersection that's kind of occurring across so many
hmm
of these areas. I love the term AI populism. I think it's such a nice, moniker to help describe, these interesting relationships that are happening. A term that I truly hate though is transitional friction. It
Uh,
annoyed me so much, in part because it's just such a econ type term, and it also does such a disservice to the workers who are basically going to be impacted by these massive technological shifts. Transitional friction like basically glosses over that people during this change are going to be like somewhat out of work for some period of time. um how do we get more people to care that like these people aren't just this economic term, they aren't just these massive stats that we see? Like, how do you help bring that unemployment issue, away, and not talk about people just as friction, but as like real families who are losing their jobs, who are going to be struggling to, make rent, be able to afford, their health bills, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have the exact same pet peeve as you. That's like part of why I wrote this piece, was because when you read the things that AI optimists write, when you read the things that Mark Andreessen or now Sam Altman, because he goes back and forth on this, like the people who are saying there's not going to be a jobs apocalypse, you read their writing, the A16Z blog, and it's always like, there are going to be new jobs. We're going to have so much economic growth. And then there will always be like a footnote somewhere, a single sentence that's like, yeah, there might be a bunch of transitional friction, but. And I'm like, transitional friction, what you mean by that is that there are millions of current workers who you think will lose their jobs. And as we know from past waves of job automation, a lot of them will never retrain. They will lose their jobs. It will be super hard for someone who's a little bit older, who may live in a specific geographic community to find new work to do, and their lives will be forever impacted. And so I think part of what I was trying to do with the New York Times piece is say, like, actually, there's this amazing quote from the economist Carl Benedict Frey where he's like, most economists acknowledge there will be some, transitional problems in the short term, but the short run can be a lifetime, right?
Right.
Like that is somebody's entire life. And so when Sam Altman says, like, I think that someday people are going to be more fulfilled than ever, there's going to be a little transitional friction, but it'll all work out. I'm like, you're still telling millions of people that they will lose their jobs. And that's where I think I got interested in studying the history of things like recent American deindustrialization as a result of both factory automation and trade with China, right? Is there are particular communities in like the Rust Belt or the Northeast that got hit really, really hard by the closure of like steel factories, textile factories, whatever. Um, People lost their jobs. Yes, it was true that GDP went up. There are jobs created elsewhere in the economy. Like I'm not saying that like there are no benefits to trade or to automation or whatever it is. But for those people who were the transitional friction, who had spent their entire lives developing a specific set of expertise and skills, who played a role in their families and in their communities, they never really recovered from losing their jobs. And that's why we have deaths of despair and opioid crisis and a right-wing populist turn in the exact counties that were most affected by deindustrialization. And I think that like when I look at American politics, when I look at the rise of Trump, I think that we are still feeling the effects of those 8 million jobs that were lost today. And you can say, oh, 8 million jobs or 2 million jobs lost to deindustrialization, depending on how you calculate it. That's nothing compared to the like 20 million jobs that were created. But I'm like, that was enough to shift our national politics. Those jobs were meant a lot to those people and to those communities that they were anchors in. And like, you can't just like imagine that people are these seamless like flows of labor that can just like go from one
Right.
thing to the other. Like the steel workers are not going to learn to code. So like if the jobs are somewhere else and for people with different skills, like they're not just going to fit into them. And so, I appreciate and I respect the economists, of course, but I think that sometimes there's a lack of, as you say, the sort of humanity that causes to realize that the friction is people and the people have desires and goals and they understand that when we say transitional friction, that's their jobs and their livelihoods that they have to protect.
Yeah, and I think the people are the friction is exactly the right way to put it. And I think what, I have also been really trying to emphasize in this work too is like the community point of this. And I think, this part of like deaths of despair or steel workers, or coal miners or all the people, in North Carolina who, were out of work because, all these furniture making companies went to China. That part of like this long sweeping narrative that we have on a national level or very long time scale can be so different place to place, and that
Mhm,
transitional friction can last, yeah, not only lifetimes but generations in
mhm.
many of these areas. And spending time in South Dakota and West Virginia and the border, like you really see that persist year after year. And I think back to your earlier point as well, that like this is not really about incomes. This is about equity. This is like placing big bets. When you lose out on those like economic footholds in the short term, it can create some of these, really long term challenges.
Yeah, I'm curious, like in your own research on this, have you seen ways that this kind of disruption was better or worse managed? Because I feel like when I'm not an expert in this kind of thing, but people always talk about like the failures of trade adjustment assistance, for example, or the fact that most of these retraining programs didn't work. Like, what could we have done then? Does that teach us anything about what we could do about localized AI job shocks?
Yeah, I think things that I've seen work well is like an awareness of the world around you in some ways, right? Like recognizing when, this industry is no longer going to work out for you and figuring out
Mm,
like adjacent industries that you can move into, right? When, farm agricultural workers, start to see that it is, no longer profitable for them to be like running, the farms that they've been running for 4 generations. How can they move from, driving tractors to start building tractors and things like that?
Mhm.
Workforce training programs have also been like incredibly powerful for making that happen, right? So,
Mhm.
I just wrote a piece about like JFK's, Manpower Development Training Act in 1962. That was one of these moments, like in the 60s, that really helped prepare people and drastically lower unemployment, specifically focusing on these people who were most at risk of job loss from technology, thinking about these, high risk areas. So I think digging into those communities instead of like, I don't know, I read OpenAI's industrial policy for the new age or whatever that paper was was titled, but they're like, what if we just created this giant wealth fund for workers so they can like benefit from this? And the scale of it seems interesting, but thinking about how it's actually applied, which communities, which types of workers, I think how the rubber hits the road on that is really quite hard.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I think that it was good that OpenAI published that in the sense that, like, there's a way in which OpenAI or any AI lab putting out these ambitious plans talking about the need for redistribution is one form of creating future accountability where then, a year down the line when/if you are seeing these major disruptions or when OpenAI does lobbying in either direction, you can go like, hey, you said that we needed this thing. Like, are you going to put up the money or not? And so I actually think that it was helpful for them to move forward the conversation on what kinds of redistribution could be necessary in a world where AI does replace labor at large scale. But like you said, like I think that was very much an early ideas document, and it would require a lot more research and a lot more specificity to actually think about what would work.
Talked a lot about labor and unemployment. I want to talk a bit about inequality as well, because I know you have touched on this and think that it's one of these areas, and I think we both agree is one of these areas that is sort of under reflected in a lot
Hmm.
of this writing. The, social stability parts, the economic mobility, job quality, as well. Like, you watch these videos of people who are like training robots how
Oh
to
my gosh,
fold
yeah.
towels and,
Hmm.
and things like that, so that way they can go like work in, those robots in a Marriott or something. Like,
Hmm.
what do you think people are missing about this inequality debate? Do you think it's fine that we've been so focused on unemployment, or do you think we need to raise the conversation on some of these other areas?
No, I definitely think we need to raise the conversation. I mean, one funny thing about that robots thing first is there's this term that I've heard a few times in San Francisco called meat robots. So, meat robots is one term that some AI people use to describe the jobs of the future where we're all just collecting data or we're doing the physical world tasks that AI can't in this narrow window between cognitive superintelligence and advanced robotics. Because we know that cognitive superintelligence is like a few years ahead of robotics. So, like, let's say there's a world where AI is way smarter than all of us, better at making decisions, better at like planning things, but robots are not. They don't have good fine motor skills yet. And so there is some world where we are all meat robots, where we're wearing these like VR headsets. Some like AI is telling us what to do, and we're like folding the clothes or like fairing things here and there, or like turning some screw because the robots aren't good enough yet. Anyway, like you said, like those are jobs, but I find those to be pretty bleak jobs and not one that I'm really excited about doing personally. And so I think one of the things that did come out of my reporting and my research over the last few months as I've been reporting out this Times piece is that, like, unemployment is one scenario for how things could go wrong. But I think that there are a lot of other ways that people could be economically and socially destabilized, such as maybe you do retrain into a new job, but the new job is much lower quality, right? And then what if you have a mortgage you got to pay? What if there's a loss of status and a sense of identity? There's like a lot of things that what if you were supporting a family on your old job and now your new job, which is maybe you're a waiter now and you used to be making 200K a year, like are you going to be able to sustain your family and your quality of life, right? Are you going to be able to sustain the loss of dignity or purpose that might come from having to take a worse job than you had before? Or when we think about inequality, I think these are political questions. Like one thing that some AI folks who are really optimistic will say is like, "Well, we'll just like do UBI or whatever." Even I have questions about whether UBI is the right solution, whether
Me too.
that redistribution would actually happen, and da 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 da. But let's say even if there was UBI, even in a world where everybody got paid like a living wage from the UBI that was redistributed from the profits that these AI companies made, that still creates a world of massive inequality, right? Because all of the people in general have no political leverage, they have no real economic leverage. They're relying on the welfare of elites who can take away that welfare at any time, whether the government or the companies. Like it creates a relation of dependence. And I think people are already very correctly worried about inequality because it creates political inequality. Yes, maybe you can meet your quality of life if consumer goods are super cheap. That's one thing people will say is like individual consumers will win because healthcare is really cheap now and digital goods are really cheap or whatever it is. But at the same time, if wealth mostly accrues to capital owners, which is one of the things that people think will happen, those people like the Elon Musks of the world are going to have really disproportionate political power. And like, what's the point of, say, a vote in democracy when Elon can buy his way into the federal government and do whatever he wants over there? And I think that people sometimes forget that in a democracy in particular, but also in general, like jobs are one form of political leverage and people asserting like their contribution to a society. And if you take away work as a way to give most people political leverage, I think things become kind of scary in terms of who actually does have control over the way that resources are distributed.
Right. I can't really imagine the union of meat robots all coming together and using their political force for it. But I think one thing that you touched on that I want to, pull a thread on is this idea of like we look at what we can measure in many ways, right?
Hmm.
That we are looking at, incomes and labor because it is something for us to track. We can look at GDP and data center parts, but this sense of like, am I working a, good job? What does it mean for my family? Do I feel a sense of pride in my work? Like as a person who loves data and spends a lot of time
Hmm.
looking at data, like those are the things that do not show up in data, but
Yeah.
very much so impact our policy environment, how we feel about the economy, like our sense of pride in our country, in our work, in our companies, like in our communities. And I think that can be incredibly destabilizing. And I think that's
Yeah.
also something that we have very much so seen in, times of history when you do have those moments where you don't feel like you are working a job that can move you up the economic ladder, that you feel like there has been this severing of your ability to like achieve the American dream. And I
Mm.
think those are a lot of the threats that are, yeah, under talked about.
Yeah.
And in part because like we don't know how much to make of them at any point. Like we don't have as clear
Mhm.
measures, whereas unemployment rate and inflation and data center spend are easier to point a
Yeah.
finger at.
I mean, people feel gaslit, I think, sometimes when like economists and policymakers focus too much on the data. I mean, we saw this during the Biden administration, right? Where like people felt like the economy was very bad. But then a lot of times, like establishment Democrats would just show people charts about like unemployment is lower than ever. So like your fears about the economy are fake or something like that. And like it could both be true that the charts they were showing were correct charts, but also that people were reporting something else real about the economy. I mean, one thing that I think about here, and one of the things that got me interested in, the AI and jobs topic was that I have a younger sister who is kind of a recent college grad. She graduated in 2025. She went to Stanford, great school. Like you would think that all Stanford students would have a very easy time getting a job, especially if you study something like data science or CS or whatever, which is what most people are studying. And one thing, so she got a job, but she was telling me about how many of her friends couldn't find a job. I think another Stanford student from her year told me that something like one third of graduates did not have a job lined up after graduation. And the thing is, did they show up in the unemployment stats? Oftentimes, no, because many of them, for example, went to grad school not because they wanted to go to grad school or had any intention of going to grad school, but because getting a master's degree was one way of kind of waiting out the I can't find a job. So let me
Right.
just delay that by going to grad school for no reason at all. Right. Or some people just take jobs that are they're underemployed. Like they are college graduates, but they end up taking a service job or some job that isn't what they trained for and where they're making much less and there's less of a ladder up to economic mobility than there would be. But all of those people wouldn't necessarily show up in the unemployment stats for new college grads. So we might just miss it if we only look at the data, which is one thing we should do, but we're not like asking people. And so I think that's creating this dynamic where people feel gaslit by economic data. And like anyone who knows a college student in the US right now, I think realizes that something is fucked up with like the new grad job market. But like if you were to just look at the stats, you would not see how bad it is. You would notice like maybe like 0.5 percentage point up and down change, but you would not realize how bad it is until you actually talk to people having these experiences.
Yeah, and I think that ability to like engage with real people and understand where the data doesn't really match our reality, is so important, or where it can mask it, right? People go to graduate school, they're not captured in it, and they come out on the other side with this advanced degree, working a job that doesn't require that advanced
Right.
degree, now with $250,000 in debt. And that really complex picture just shows up in all of these different silos that become really hard for folks to stitch together. But I think the work that you are doing of like connecting all of these different narratives of talking to, policymakers and students and economists and historians and yeah, recent graduates in this space is really how we help build a lot of this, narrative of what is going on. I want to wrap us up with the final question that we always kind of, finish on with American inequality, which is around the path forward. Like it can often feel like these problems are so overwhelming. You talked about like scale, that it does really feel like this unique point in time for us to be thinking about AI populism and the underclass and, these issues of inequality. But are there two or three things that you think, either people on this call or nonprofits or policymakers or folks at these large tech companies can do to start addressing some of these, social or labor or like, yeah, future dated issues that we're starting to wrestle with?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know what to do, and I'm not a policy expert by any means. So there are smarter people than me to answer this question. But maybe one thing I'll say is that one thing that's frustrated me about some of the AI and jobs conversation is it focuses on these extreme long run scenarios, right? So like, will we either get in a permanent underclass or will we have more abundance than ever or something? And it turns out that both of those people agree on, for example, the near term transitional friction of a
Right.
lot of millions of people's jobs being disrupted, particularly if you work in like X, Y, and Z roles. And so I would love if policymakers and other folks working in this space said, okay, like we can actually put aside some of the more extreme scenarios. Like, yes, we can do some future forecasting, whatever, but we actually have pretty good reason to believe that like 50-year-old women clerical workers in suburbs or 22-year-old college graduates going into marketing, illustration, and software engineering are going to be seriously impacted. And so, like, why don't we focus on figuring out what our solutions are for those people? Like, are there retraining programs that work? Should we trial run on the job apprenticeships instead of sending people to more graduate school? If we believe that more people are going to be starting small businesses or entrepreneurs or freelancers, maybe we need to rethink the whole universal healthcare thing because we're assuming a world where most people are working in these like giant firms before. And I think most AI analysts will say that one of the outcomes of AI is firms will be leaner, there will be smaller, and there will be more of them. And so if that's true, then we need to make sure we have a good benefit system that works for people who are entrepreneurs or small business owners or whatever, and not just for people who work at big firms. Or if we know that there's going to be some disruption, we should think about extending unemployment insurance. It's 6 months in California. I think it should probably be longer than that. And so, again, I sometimes want to get away from these like very speculative apocalyptic scenarios and say, we actually know enough right now to be able to take some of the policy actions or to at least do the planning of like, if we see unemployment hit this number, if we start to see these effects in the labor market, these are things we can do now and they're not going to be that crazy.
Jasmine, you undersold yourself in saying that you were not a policy expert because even though there might be, policy experts who have views on this, you touched on kind of all of the, I think, big things that people are, digging in on in this space of like healthcare, job lock, unemployment insurance, apprenticeships, yeah, training folks up. And so I think those are some really hopeful messages for us to end on. I also just dropped your terrific Substack in the chat. I hope everybody goes to check it out. Jasmine, it was such a joy chatting with you today. I'm looking forward to posting this video tomorrow and keeping the conversation moving.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on. Really appreciate it. You're doing great work.
All right. Talk soon, Jasmine.